Just at the beginning, perhaps you could just say who you are and the organisation you represent.
I'm Councillor Simon Blackburn, leader of Blackpool Council.
Robin Wales, I'm elected Mayor of Newham.
Councillor Tony Newman, leader of Croydon Council and representing the LGA, London.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. Before we come back to you, just ask committee members to put on record any interests they may have that may be relevant to this inquiry. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association. I also have one property which I rent out.
I employ council in my staff team.
Yes.
I employ a council in my staff team.
I'm a member of the Metropolitan Borough Council. I employ two councillors in my constituency.
I'm Vice President of the LGA and also have a small property portfolio.
Right, okay. Thank you very much for coming to be with us this afternoon. To begin with, just to talk about the challenges in the private rented sector that you're facing. I mean, we're probably aware that the different parts of the country have different challenges. So, in your particular areas, what are the main challenges, the main issues that you are currently trying to address and deal with in the private rented sector?
If I may, Chairman, a particular issue that faces not just Blackpool but seaside towns in general and coastal resorts is the dramatic size of conversions from former hotels and bed and breakfasts into poor quality private rented flats. Almost all of that is driven entirely by the amount of rent that can be obtained through the local housing allowance, through the housing benefit system. And that's a particular challenge in terms of displacing people from metropolitan areas where rents are higher and it's harder to get housing at a social rent. But also in terms of the amount of issues which people living in that type of accommodation are likely to face. And that can be anything from drug addiction, mental health problems, people can be fleeing from domestic violence, etc., etc. So a significant drain on the local economy as a consequence.
I mean, we've seen a dramatic increase in the private rented sector, more than doubled in the last 10, 12 years. In many places in London, it's it's up to 30% plus of the market for many people as home ownership becomes a distant dream, if not challenge. It is the only option in terms of housing, and I think that's why in terms of whether it's letting fees or driving up standards or conditions, it's imperative that collectively we act now as local and national governments to improve the lives of those relying perhaps in the longer term than they would have been on the private rented sector, and actually empowering tenants in the private rented sector to give them a bit more security in terms of conditions and security of tenure. So I think it's going to be for many years to come absolutely a key part of housing supply, both in areas of high demand and perhaps different challenges where the demand in supply is not so high.
I think this is taken us by surprise. The speed of the change in the last decade has been absolutely extraordinary. Now, I think there are absolutely different problems. What Blackpool has is a problem of people moving out from places like London, which people can't afford the rents. They have to move out, especially if they're on benefit. It is almost impossible if you're on benefit to get property in places like Newham. It's cheaper when you move to some of the seaside towns, and so you get a completely different problem there that has to be tackled in a different way. Licensing is an answer, but it's a different problem. In Newham, we'll say that 10 years ago 21% were private rented, now it's 46%. That's not true. We don't know. We don't know what it was. We know it's 46 now. We don't know what it was 10 years ago because nobody knows, I think except us, what the extent of the private rented sector is. Because with a borough-wide licensing, landlord licensing, we are able to now identify the problems. And for Newham, the problem is quite simply shocking conditions, absolutely shocking conditions. 25 people in a 3-bedroom house is not unusual. You can't have neighbours with 25 people living next door. Harry Potter, we had a guy, and a radar went on, he's sleeping under the stairs. And if you've seen the film, there was more space in Harry Potter's cupboard than this one. 2 people living in a walk-in freezer. Now, £500 for a bed in a bedroom with 4 beds, bunk beds. Now, £500. Shocking conditions. A family living in a place that's been built with chipboard, and the fridge, and they have a fridge and a washing machine, and they're in the garden powered from the kitchen because they're living in the garden. Now that's the problem we've got, and it's we now know we have 51,000 properties. We know we have 28,000 landlords, and we've prosecuted 1,200. So that tells you roughly how many good landlords we've got, or landlords that are trying. And the scale of the problem, 1,200, multiply that by how many people in each property, and it's absolutely shocking, which is why we need a different response. Well, we need a response. What we need in each place may be different, but it's the same kind of response. We think in Newham, because we had the first borough-wide one and we got the information, we can point to that and say, that is what our country is like in large swathes of London, and in large swathes, I'm sure, in some of the cities, but particularly inner cities. And I know some of you came on a raid recently. We think it's getting better, but it's challenging. I'm sure we'll pick that up later. Shocking conditions in the 21st century.
And from an LGA perspective, perhaps just to turn it.
Well, I mean, I think one of the key things, because my own borough rapidly followed Newham in implementing what is now the last borough-wide scheme that we currently see, because I think we have to see, in terms of local government, power devolve to local councils to take decisions about whether they wish to have a licensing scheme in their town, their city or their borough. And I think the understanding of the current regulations is you can implement up to 20%. I think we have to go back to the Minister in 2 or 3 years' time to seek permission to carry on. And I think we just need to change the narrative. I mean, if local government means anything, then surely it means local people deciding on what they want to see, where they live and in the place they live. And the idea of all the ideas, frankly, that can be controlled from an office in Whitehall seems, frankly, preposterous. So we would want to see real devolution in this area. And look, it won't work everywhere, and there'll be different solutions and different problems. I think you've already heard from colleagues here, but surely you devolve it to local people to find out answers locally.
We'll come back to licensing and explore that in a bit more detail in due course. I mean, that's one other issue that's come to light recently or got some publicity is lockdown properties, which seems to be getting away with the need to have planning permission to convert larger houses into what effectively are separate rooms, and then charging people significant amounts of housing benefit for the privilege of living in these pretty minute spaces. Are local authorities doing all they can to actually stop this?
Absolutely. But the local authorities are limited in terms of what they can do. We keep on top of new conversions. We are, wherever we see building works taking place, that the local authority doesn't know about, either through the planning process or through the building regulation process. We will investigate and we'll seek to stop those. We will insist that people apply for retrospective planning permission if works have already begun. But the wider problem is that we see premises such as former hotels and guest houses being subdivided into up to 20 bedsits. Now, if that's been done under the radar, which is perfectly possible to do with very minimal, if any, external works to the property. So it's highly unlikely that unless a neighbour or another occupant were to report it, it's highly unlikely the local authority could find out about it. Under the current regulations, once the owner of that building has been breaking the law for 4 years, they are entitled to apply for a certificate of lawfulness to demonstrate that they've been breaking the law for 4 years, under which circumstances the local authority has its hands bound and has to grant a certificate of lawfulness for that use. So the local authorities are doing all they can, but put simply, they can't do very much.
So for me there are 2 key issues here, and Jared did hear you on Inside Out refer to this question. There's 2 issues. One is to know what is happening, and the other is to enforce against it. Now, to know what is happening, you won't unless you have a licensing system. In our case, we have a licensing system covering the whole borough, and then we've used data analytics to identify those people who have not licensed, and that's the key. Without a licensing scheme, there's thousands. I mean, when there's 50,000 properties, you can't identify them. Obviously, the ones where people haven't registered are the ones we were particularly interested in, and that's where some of the greatest successes take place. You link that with a very, very strong enforcement regime, and we have 40 police officers, we have 100-odd enforcement officers. You have to put the effort in, which is why we prosecuted 1,200 landlords. But the result of that is because we then know, because of the data analytics that we've done, and because we can identify where this is happening, we can go after people before those 4 years pass. Because quite often people won't tell you. They don't want to get involved, they don't want to tell their neighbour. There's all sorts of reasons why you won't hear about it. And so quite often some of these properties may have been dodgy as well, with people using it. Now they've got more. But to be fair, we don't have a lot of problem like that in Newham, but we will identify it because we have both the licensing scheme, which enables the ones that haven't licensed to stand out, and then follow that up with very, very significant elements of enforcement. Without enforcement, I don't think the licensing system works. But with proper enforcement, you can go and then identify them. And I have to say, we've had 5 years of the first scheme. We've started the next 5-year scheme, and our plan is in this 5-year scheme to spend a lot of time visiting those landlords who aren't, who are licensed, and say, can we help you? Can we do something? I mean, we don't want to be punitive to the good landlords. We want to be supportive. Quite a lot of our landlords, we discovered, are single landlords and want to do the right thing. So if we can help them a bit in that, great. But with this system, and with enforcement and with the data analytics, you can identify where this is taking place and stop it. But there's a huge backlog. It's a big, big job to do this. We thought there were 5,000 places that weren't licensed just in HMO terms. So it was a big job.
And we would want to see, you get fines £1,000 or less where people are making, tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds. I think there needs to be greater penalties around this. I mean, it is putting, in some cases, lives at risk, bluntly.
But lockdown properties are quite legal, aren't they?
Well,
you use permitted development to avoid the planning system.
It's avoiding the planning system, and it's possibly avoiding some of even the current licensing structures. I mean, one of the interesting things that came out when we introduced the borough-wide licensing scheme 2.5 years ago in Croydon was a significant amount of those applying for a licence. We became rapidly aware they had brand new gas safety fire certificates, which would suggest they may not have had them in place before they applied for the licence. So the incentive of licensing, coupled with a strong regime of penalties where people are breaking the law. But the HMO issue, I think there needs to be greater clarity around how the system is structured, which does enable, as Robin has just said, people to work their way around it.
Yeah, but I mean, there are quite a lot of, I understand, particularly outer London boroughs haven't got a licensing system, but we've got this lockdown property issue where people are literally paying a fortune for a small room, and lots of people are paying for small fortunes in the same property for small rooms. I mean, this can't be right. I mean, what's the LGA's position on this? I mean,
well, I think we need, within the national. The law of the land, if you like. I mean, if people are within the law, it's difficult. But we do not.
The law changing.
We need to see the law change. So where they are not, we are seeing Karen Buck's bill and other bills. In terms of standards that people are living in, a local government can enforce some of that. But if it's not illegal, if it's not illegal, then we come back to the terms of what you do or don't have in a local licence.
One of the problems you've got there is that every piece of legislation has its own process. It's very difficult to follow through. It's very difficult to do the thing, because it's just complex and slow. The advantage of licensing is you can set some licensing conditions, and those licensing conditions can quite often be tougher than the basic conditions that have been set. So we have things like a landlord has to inspect the property every 6 months, has to provide gas certificates. You can put that in a licence. And I think there's a really interesting question and debate here. If we are going to make our places better places to live, When Parliament legislates, it needs to think really hard about how that's carried through and how it's done. The more bureaucracy you give us, the worse it is. One of the criticisms of the licence scheme is we have to do things we don't want to do because we want to keep it simple as we possibly can for landlords, because we don't want to introduce bureaucracy, and actually it suits us to be simpler. So we might argue that ideally in legislation as an approach, we should be saying we want to make a place work. Local authorities, you are in a better place to judge the sort of things you do. Blackpool isn't a bit. I would dream of judging what Blackpool needs, but I don't suppose they judge what I need, and that's kind of the licensing regulations give us. The licensing system gives us more.
Let's move on to local authority powers now.
So,
Mike.
Yes, so which parts of the current legislative framework are covering your powers to intervene with the private sector are least effective?
Through you, Chairman, there was an issue just before Christmas, consultation on what would and would not be covered in future by mandatory licence schemes.
Yeah.
There was a real opportunity there to include Section 257, is that right? Yes, Section 257 HMOs within that definition. And that hasn't happened. So that although there has been an extension to
Could you just explain a bit more about 257?
Yeah, certainly. So Section 257 HMOs are effectively buildings that have been converted without complying with the 1991 building regulation standard, either before 1991 or after 1991, and they still don't meet that building regulation standard. Providing more than, I think, a third of those are let on short-term tenancies, and there are no, strictly speaking, communal areas, then they fall under what's called Section 257 of the 2004 Housing Act. That sounds like a very technical explanation, but it captures a large number of properties. So in Blackpool, we estimate that there are between 3,500 and 4,000 HMOs, houses in multiple occupancy. Had Section 257 HMOs been included, we would have captured a further 1,700 in the mandatory licensing net. Whereas as it is, the changes that were made just after Christmas bring in only about an extra 100 properties. So by including that much less prescriptive definition of a house in multiple occupation will make a significant difference to what local authorities can inspect on a mandatory basis.
So I think I'm right in saying there are different definitions of HMOs and different legislation for housing and it's for different purposes for planning. So again, I come back and say there's a lot of bureaucracy in it. It would be better if it was permissive within limits in terms of what we might do. But currently, for example, there's an arbitrary cap of 20% of a local authority area, and we've just gone through the process of having to reapply. Now, I can perhaps explain this as something we did some time ago, because we do quite a lot of enforcement in lots of different things. So we went after trade waste, and we discovered 18% of the businesses in our borough didn't have trade waste. So we followed them, made sure they got it, and got it down to 2%. And then, for a reason, right, we stopped doing it. We went back 6 months later and we go back up to 8%. You cannot, if you have a licensing scheme, stop it. If you stop it, they will come back. The people we're talking about are crooks and villains, and they don't care what they do to other people. If you can get £500 for a bed in Newham, that's better than getting £1,200 for a two-bedroom. Well, you get £1,200 if you're renting out your home, or £1,400 for a two-bedroom, but I can get £500 and put 4 of you in a room. So that's what happens. That comes back to what Tony said. I do not understand why we don't... If people are running businesses where they break the law, then the punishment needs to break the business model. The example I like to give, because it's nice and clear cut, if you have somebody who breaks a packet of cigarettes up to sell individual cigarettes to children, to kill them, tell me why they should be permitted to retain their business, because they are consciously doing something that we all understand is evil. It's the same with people who dump waste as part of the business model. They get caught, pay a fine, that's all right, it's part of the business model. With landlords, you get caught, you pay a fine, it's part of the business model. If you've got 25 people in a home, which is not unusual, Jeremy Hayward came down and discovered 24 in one night. If you've got 25 people in a property, that's £12,500 a month, I'm sorry, you're going to have be pretty... We think confiscation of the property. We think a proper thing that says your business model will be broken if we catch you doing these things consciously, we'll take your property. And that way, the business model won't work anymore. We have to break the business model. So that means there have to be fines that are properly substantial fines. We have to look, I think we should give more flexibility to local authorities to be able to say the sort of things we want to enforce to make sure. My fire brigade says that we have undoubtedly saved lives because we know that fire safety is really important, and when we go in, we try and do something. We've got lists to that effect. That's what we need to do. And when legislation is drawn up, sensibly we should be saying, how can we be permissive to local authorities who aren't stupid? We don't want to do bad. We don't want to spend money wasting our time. We just want to make things better for the people that live in our borough.
So let me clarify that. Is literally a substantive fine would be
lose your business, lose the house.
Yeah,
lose the house. If you've got 25 people in a house and you shouldn't have it, you lose your house. Let the banks worry about the mortgage then, because the banks are loaning to these people based on... And again, it's interesting, I will come back. One of the things we've said to HMRC is, what are you doing about tax on these people? Because our understanding is that half of the landlords are not known to HMRC. Now, at what point are HMRC going to do their job and tax these landlords? And what about the half that are paying tax? What about them who are doing the right thing? Now, I just filling in my tax return yesterday, I thought of writing and say, I'm not going to pay tax because you don't seem to be that bothered. But I don't suppose I'll get away with it. Going to try.
Look, I mean,
you've actually announced it anyway.
I mean, you need the tough penalties, but they are the exception. I mean, in my borough, there's 32,500 private rented properties, 30,000 plus are now licensed. A scheme that was being attacked only 4 years ago as a tenants tax is now embraced by most landlords work with us and welcome it. And the experience directly I've got in Croydon is of a scheme that's up running and working. And the evidence is, and whether some of the more extreme cases Robin's talked about and others, that where you bring the schemes in, it improves the quality of life for the tenants in those homes. And why wouldn't you give? I think that's the question. Why wouldn't you give the powers for other schemes to be brought in? If local people vote for local politicians who say that's what they'll do. If they don't, well, that's the call. I mean, there is an issue, I think, in terms of the minimum standards we would want to see national government set in terms of coming back to the HMO. Whether it's gas safety, obviously the current very serious issue of fire safety, whatever. But in terms of implementation of a local scheme and what might be in it, then the need will vary as we're hearing here from depending where you are in the country.
I think there are two other issues that run alongside that. Tony's just touched on the national minimum standards which apply at the moment. So if we look at the 1985 Housing Act, Part 10 of that sets out minimum standards for buildings. That will permit a bedroom of 6.5 square metres. That's not big enough to fit a bed in, never mind a wardrobe or any of the other things we might expect to find in a bedroom. So those housing health and safety rating system standards need to be revisited as a matter of urgency. The other thing that I would see runs in parallel with that, and Robin touched on this, is the way the local housing allowance system works at the moment, because that hugely and disproportionately benefits people who break properties up into lots of small units. There is currently no incentive there at all to operate a property as a 2-bedroom flat if you can break it down into 3 bedsits, and it's that perverse incentive that really does need to be addressed.
You've touched upon my next question, which is around the housing health and safety rating system.
Yeah.
You've all, rightfully pointed out the huge growth in the private sector. So how would you update that? You give one example there, but give me more.
There needs to be a much more realistic size specification for properties. First of all, there needs to be more resource available for local authorities, both through the planning system, through the building regulation system, and through the subsequent enforcement systems, to ensure that that's being adhered to. As Robin commented before, it's all well and good visiting these premises once. You can serve notices of works. You can go back and make sure those works have been done. But 12 months later, due to the nature of the business and the huge incentives which exist for reconverting premises back into very small units, there's going to be a significant issue with that. But I think the other point to make is, in terms of the current HHSRS, research by the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health found that 97% of environmental health professionals working in housing support an update to that scheme. More than half of them said that they encounter hazards that are not addressed by that scheme whatsoever. There's a huge evidence base, and the wording of it is far too subjective. The best example I can give you, the most commonly found, what's referred to in the legislation or the guidance rather as a Category 1 hazard, is excess cold. But the preventative measures listed that can have an effect on the likelihood and harm of that in the scoring matrix just include tick boxes which refer to appropriate levels of thermal insulation or heating systems, expressions such as properly sized and sited ventilation. So property can have all of those things. You can tick all of the boxes, but it doesn't mean it's not excessively cold within that property. It doesn't mean that the residents aren't going to suffer. So it's a sort of binary tick box approach to that piece of legislation, which is 1985. I think it's probably time for a midpoint review to see how that's working, and it isn't.
That's great. Thank you, Simon.
So it's what I'm saying a bit earlier. The licensing, we can put licensing conditions which are a bit, which are more sensible and more rational. I think one of the problems is if Parliament would pass legislation that is more permissive and say, right, what do we do? How do we learn from lessons? A great example would be FOBTs, where Parliament passed legislation which has been an absolute disaster, but there's been no opportunity to change that. Or I know the review's now going, but it's instead of saying, well, let's see what actually happened with it. Let's look at it after a year and find out what's happening. It's a bit like this too. Let's look and see what might happen. How do we make things more relevant? Because the people on the ground are the ones doing the work. So what they find in Blackpool, what they find in Newham, what they find in Croydon, feeding that back the way that allows us to be more sensible about the kind of legislation we do. But see, I think permissive legislation that says, well, local authorities aren't unreasonable and aren't stupid. They do by and large sensible things, and they're on the ground doing those things. So for me, a big issue at the moment, we've said, can we enforce the minimum wage, please? 20% of my people don't get paid the minimum wage. That's not a big issue, I suspect, in Richmond, though I'll have to ask Richmond about that. It's about seeing what's going on in places and saying, what do you need to enable us to carry things properly through? Just an aside, by the way, I just passed a wee note about we had a fly tipper who's making £500,000 in profit, and he got a £4,000 fine. When you do that sort of thing, how are we supposed to stop these people? Yeah, why doesn't he lose his business? It drives me crazy. We need tougher. These are civil. I mean, just lose the business. You could go to prison as well. I'm not against it, but nevertheless, it's the breaking the business model.
Tony, Tony, you referred to Karen Buck's bill actually earlier on in the conversation. Look, you're at the coalface. Is there anything you, as key players in terms of the local government world, would like to add to that? Is there anything that could improve Karen Buck's bill?
I hesitate to say it's perfect. But look, I would come back to, the honest answer is I would need to study more the detail of it, because the point I'm going to come back to is the enforcement. Words are fine, but around decent home standards, we've all been through that discussion with council homes, licensing schemes, whatever. But it's how do we make sure that if it is local government, national government, but local government, we as you say, are at the front line of this. How do we make sure we have the resource to enforce the quality of a decent home, whatever the tenure, You know, we are all living in a world of significant cuts to our budgets, and often it's our frontline services like environmental health or trading standards, rightly or wrongly, that tend to get cut back before perhaps some other statutory more statutory services. So I don't know, but I mean I think my take on that issue is to ensure that we have maximum devolution of the power to local government, and that has to be backed up with, where appropriate, the resources in the right areas. Otherwise, even the finest of bills, we won't be able to act on.
Also, it doesn't, placing the onus upon the tenant to take legal action against the landlord is, when I think of the people who I represent, people living at the poor quality end of the private rented sector are highly unlikely to have the resources or the time to know how to begin taking legal action against the landlord. We're all free to buy a Rolls Royce, but the vast majority of us can't exercise that freedom. Likewise, the ability to sue a landlord is to most of the people I represent, going to be highly academic. It heightens the risk of retaliatory evictions by landlords, even though that is supposed to be against the law. But also it does nothing to address the space and size standards that I laid out before. It does add a number of categories to the list of category 1 defects in a property, but it doesn't address the basic standards. So whilst the bill in itself is not unhelpful and it draws attention to issues around buildings being fit for human habitation, it doesn't do anything to improve those standards, and it places the onus on the tenant. The other thing it doesn't do, which is a key measure and reflects a lot of what Robin's talked about, is making the amount of money which is payable in terms of local housing allowance in some way reflect the quality of the accommodation and the size of the accommodation. This won't do anything to tackle that. We need to be in a place whereby local authorities can pay higher rents for decent quality, decent size property, and lower rents for where they've got an excess supply of poor quality properties and bedsits.
I think it's a useful bill. I think it's good. Our experience is that tenants will find it very difficult to exercise the powers. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't have the right to do it, and it's good if they're able to do it. Our experience, this is now anecdote, but whenever I've gone on a raid, by and large, the tenants that are there are pleased to see us. They can't say anything. They are in a very difficult position. The landlord will kick them out. We have notices up when we go into properties that says don't let the council in. We find notices that say don't let the council in because the landlords know why we're coming. And they will put pressure on tenants. And why are people living there? It's because it's what they can afford. Mostly not on benefit. In fact, pretty much very few. One of the indicators of a likely HMO that's not licensed is that it hasn't got benefit claimants there, because it's a different kind of model. And you have to go early in the morning, as some of you know, if you're going to get anybody in, because they go off to work. So it's a kind of very... so I think the bill is to be welcomed, but we think that if it's going to work, well, actually, councils should support people, and that would be resource, and we'll always ask for more resource, but with some justification, as we've taken I think we're the sector that's taken the largest cuts and still managed to maintain services, and if the government was as good as local government, my goodness, the country would be so much better. I just offer you that as a wee thought. The other thing which I will just say, and I think it's one of the things that annoys me, we have substantial homelessness issues. Let's be absolutely clear. I'm not going to be people on the streets here. The homelessness operation is about government pushing housing benefit onto councils and making us pay for it. On average, we pay £3,500 for everybody we've got in temporary accommodation, other than the ones we bought some time ago. So we are paying what housing benefit ought to pay, and that puts pressure on our... And but essentially, it's the government's ways of shunting costs off. And since it's shunted off to places that are actually quite poor, I think it's not fully understood. Homelessness and temporary accommodation ends up just being the government making us pay for it, and it's a major problem. I'm not talking about people sleeping on the streets. It's a very different issue from homelessness, where people are put in temporary accommodation. The only exception to that is we bought 1,800 properties some time ago that people are now living in at LHA rates. So 1,800 of our notionally temporary accommodation are actually full-time, but the rest, 3,500 on average. Last time I looked, 3,500 on average, that should be getting paid by housing benefit but aren't. That then makes it harder to get people into properties, which means we have the shuttle. Means they can't necessarily stay where they are, and they end up going to Blackpool and elsewhere. The whole thing is broken badly. It's just a frustration.
We need to move on, actually.
Sorry.
Okay.
Your take on the reasons that the Residential Landlords Association gave us last week for the relatively low, very low in most parts of the country, levels of local authority enforcement in the private rented sector. So they gave us 3 reasons. They said they think that environmental health officers find it difficult to understand what their powers are and how to use them, that most local authorities have insufficient resources, and that most local authorities also lacked the political will to address standards aggressively in the sector. I was just wondering if you agree with that analysis, and if not, what views or what reasons you would attribute to the relatively low levels of enforcement across the country.
I agree with them on the resources. Yes. But I think that's a sweeping statement in terms of most authorities lacking the will. Without going through the arguments again, I mean, in terms of these powers, most authorities actually, at the moment, under the current legislation, couldn't take you couldn't bring in the borough-wide licensing scheme we brought in Croydon at the moment. So, I'd be interested to know if they would have supported a rolling out of selective licensing schemes. I don't know. I mean, I think it's we've all got local narratives here as well as the national issue. I am acutely aware, I think I gave evidence to this committee 4 years ago when there was absolute opposition to what was happening in Newham and proposed in Croydon. It feels like a different climate, but maybe it's different. It's in different places in different parts of the country. But I would return to the within the national framework the need to empower politicians locally to take those decisions about what's needed in their area. And actually, although it's sometimes easy to cast this as a very confrontational issue between local government and landlords associations, that there are the cases where it comes to that. But in many examples, actually people getting around a table and working together about what's best for their area, that's a far more positive approach. And we're starting to work with landlords now who and they wouldn't have said it 4 years ago, are happy to be associated with the licensing scheme, and it's seen as a sort of some sort of kite mark, if you like, in terms of quality. And so I think we have we can reset the debate, but every time the Landlords Association or whoever come out and with 1 or 2 statements that are more confrontational, I don't think it helps.
I had the pleasure of reading the dodgy dossier that they gave you last week, and it is dodgy. So I look at it and it says that one analysis of the between 2011 and 2014 found that of the 10 London boroughs with the highest rates of prosecution, just 2 operate any form of licensing scheme. However, of the top 10, of the top 9 after Newham, 152 prosecutions, we did 359. So when they say we'll exclude the top 2, what they're saying is we'll take away 75% of all prosecutions. We do 5% of all the planning prosecutions in this country in Newham. And when I look at some of they also did some assessments when they removed Newham and Barking and Dagenham. Now I wonder why. The truth is that if you don't enforce, you're wasting your time. It's just wasting your time. It's just a tax on landlords, and why would you do it? It's not a sensible thing to do. I think there's an argument, and I hope HMRC will consider this, for having all landlords licensed, so at least we know who's paying tax. I think that's really important, and we shouldn't miss that. As far as prosecutions are concerned, we've done 60% of all the prosecutions in London last year, right? About half in the country. We believe that's necessary in order to make sure that things that we do it properly. Now, what's interesting about that is that now talking to my colleagues, because we were first in, talking to Waltham Forest, Barking and Dagenham and Redbridge, they're all moving into this and taking enforcement very seriously, because guess what? The landlords we're driving out are moving in next door. Well, my colleagues there don't want that either, and they are also upping the game. And I think what you see is, because we've done it properly, I think, you see that, certainly in East London, you're seeing now a ramping up and a response by politicians. Now, resources are an issue. We took a decision that it was more important to do this than pretty much other things, but then we haven't made any cuts, so we think this is very important. And we wanted, as I say earlier, to do minimum wage enforcement, because again, I think our purpose should be about people and about creating places that are good for people, and that means doing things. So we've put 35,000 people into work through our workplace scheme, and we've transformed work because we think people are what matters. So my answer to you would be, you must enforce, or you're just wasting your time, and it is an inappropriate system. But if you do enforce, help us with how much easier for us to enforce if the fines were substantial, and help. I don't see why the landlords who are forcing us to do this shouldn't end up paying for the cost of enforcement, because why not? Because they're the ones we're having to enforce against. The good landlords, we want to keep the cost of them down as low as we can, because we don't want to affect it. But there is no doubt that when the RLA came to you and said those things, to exclude Newham is a piece of nonsense, because we are a local authority like everybody else, and excluding us skews the figures the other way. But I am now seeing evidence that it's moving on. And indeed, Tony, in Croydon, it begins to move out, and people begin to do things. One of our problems might be it took so long to get our renewal of a licence, despite the fact we prosecuted 1,200 landlords. It's created problems for us. So it would help if government were a bit quicker to assist us. But you must enforce whatever that takes. Otherwise, I don't think you should be doing it, if I'm honest, because what's the point? Unless, of course, HMRC want to fund it, because they'll get all the tax back.
Sure, okay.
I think every step forward that's been taken by local government in this field over the past 7 years that I've been the leader of the council, I've had to go on the radio either as a leader of Blackpool Council or as a spokesman for the LGA and go toe to toe with the RLA or another trade union for landlords, because at every point they will always deploy the argument that councils don't need X as a new power because they've already got plenty of powers, and they will then say, and they're not utilising the powers that are available to them. They're not enforcing. Just in terms of the first small part of Blackpool that was subject to selective licensing, there was 875 properties licensed, 752 schedules of work issued, 87 formal notices issued, and 16 prosecutions. So the vast majority of those were settled out of court, if you will, because the landlords did what they needed to do. But 875 properties needing 752 different schedules of works. So local authorities are enforcing. As Tony said, there is an issue around resources. Landlord licensing schemes invariably cost the local authority more than they're able to charge in fees. That will not stop the landlords from subjecting you to a barrage of freedom of information requests to try and demonstrate that we are in some way making a few quid out of this, when of course in fact it's costing us money. But yeah, and the idea that there's a lack of political will, with all due respect, you wouldn't be asking us these questions and we wouldn't be answering them if there wasn't a cross-party agreement both at national government and in local government that this is an area that desperately needs to be tackled, because irrespective of politics and irrespective of geography, this is an issue that affects all of us and our constituents to a greater or lesser degree.
I think that point should be reinforced. The LGA perspective, much of the work around the private rented sector is cross-party agreement around the challenge. It's probably still not completely cross-party in terms of Conservative colleagues around the need to have 3 or 5 year secure tenancies, but that's a work in progress. But I think this agenda is changing. Part of it because it has to, because so many people in this country for years to come are going to be living in the private rented sector, perhaps in a longer term way than that was never envisaged a generation ago.
Can I ask about the depth of impact of the enforcement that you do undertake? So when you are undertaking enforcement activity, is it essentially just dealing with the very worst of the worst, or are you finding that you're enforcing against the very worst landlords but also other breaches, and are you finding that impact generally is having the effect of driving up standards across the board?
I would say we haven't had the appalling issue at the level of, I know Robin has in Newham, of the beds in sheds issue, and we've had some of that, but it's predominantly not been that. I mean, we're starting to see landlords perhaps where tenants would have been a lot of this is anecdotal, but it's coming together in terms of evidence base, where people would have been in fear of a notice being issued and an eviction if they complained about condensation, damp or whatever. And these are serious issues, not the most serious, but serious. The licensing scheme is working as much as when that is brought to the council's attention, either by the tenant or through an inspection, we are without resorting to prosecution, able to see improvements, and they might be sometimes small improvements, but if you can take the condensation out of a bedroom with young children sleeping in it, you're probably doing an awful lot for their long-term health gain. So it is in a sort of softer areas, definitely already having an impact, I think, around wider health issues.
So this is a really difficult question. If I give an example, we set up our workplace scheme. We got 35,000 jobs filled with our people, and the question I asked was, did it make a difference, or was it just noise that was, And it was index of multiple deprivation figures came out which showed that we had shot up in employment. Now, do I have such a figure for landlord licensing? No, I don't. We're trying to. We did it for 5 years, so we've tackled the ones we know are worse. The ones we know are worse, the ones that hadn't licensed. So we put a system in place to identify them. That's the power of the license system, is you can identify those bad ones. Then, of course, the other ones, you can go and work with them. Anecdotally, my experience, and I think it came with the visit, I'm seeing less bad than I saw 2-3 years ago. It was just horrific. I had one of your colleagues wanted to string the landlord up when he came into the property, and we had to explain that you had to go through due process of law before you could hang the landlord. But he was very angry, and quite rightly. Now, what I've charged our people to, because I'm a great fan, everything should be driven by evidence. We're going to see if we can now identify a positive change in what's happened. One would imagine that going into these properties, making them do things, making it better, driving 1,200 landlords out, one would imagine it will get better. But all we've got is the activity information. That's not the same as being able to absolutely prove that, look, it was 35% bad, now it's 25% bad. But that's one of the things we're working on. We have the same problem. We teach every kid to play a musical instrument. Does that make a difference? We can't prove it. We know there's evidence that says it should do, but how do you actually prove it? It's really difficult to do. So my answer to you would be, I think it does. I think we can look in terms of activity and in terms of the very worst landlords we're driving out. But does that just mean they go next door? I think there's some evidence that's happened. So my colleagues are responded. But I can't, if I'm honest, say I have absolute proof. But we are looking to work that now in the second run of the scheme to see if we can get sort of capture that. But you imagine the narrative looks very strong, I think, would be my answer.
In Blackpool, we've just completed our evaluation of our first selective licensing scheme. And what it shows us is that it's very effective in helping us enforce minimum standards and to deal with the worst of the worst. But as we discussed earlier, those HHSRS standards are very low indeed. So all it helps you to do is to deal with the worst bit of it. The other benefit to a licensing scheme like this is it allows us to get behind the front door of properties that we would never otherwise have got into. And if you do, as we do, adopt a multi-agency approach to that, so you go out with colleagues from the Fire and Rescue Service, colleagues from the police, from the Department of Work and Pensions, and from social care, that enables you to intervene in other situations which would otherwise have remained hidden. So there's an additional qualitative benefit to it. But does a licensing scheme provide the answer to poor quality accommodation? Is it the key strategic lever? No, it isn't. But it's part of a suite of measures that can help to improve the quality of the PRS in any one area.
Just moving on, I think we've kind of got a feeling about this, but I just want to make clear whether there's evidence yet that selective licensing schemes on their own, do they improve the quality of accommodation? Or, I think, Sir Robin, you made clear that if you don't enforce it, that they're almost not worth it. But have you got evidence from the reviews that you've done that the quality of accommodation generally, you talked about really bad landlords who are clearly criminals, but about the general aspects of the properties that are subject to the licensing schemes. Is there evidence yet that they're improved?
I think we go back to properties to make sure that things are being... Interesting, the number of people we find who haven't done what they were supposed to do, we're fairly comfortable we can see something on that. Our take is that for the last few years we've been focusing on the very difficult criminal landlords. They're the ones we really wanted to get after. Now, the next 5 years we're very expressly saying we want to work with all landlords, so we put the fee up a bit, and in order that we can go and work with all landlords and drive the quality up. I would go along with Simon. I think there are other things you do as well to drive quality up. We look to buy property. We've set up a company to build a lot more homes, a lot better quality homes. Honestly, the answer to bad property in London is to build an awful lot more homes. That would solve both the rent issue, it would solve the problem of homelessness, it would solve the problem of... Because then, if you've got competition in enough properties, you wouldn't have the difficulty.
I'm looking at specifically licensing, because you've got experience of licensing schemes, where other parts of London and the country haven't.
I get that, and I was going to come back to that. I would just say that if we are going to resolve the problem of housing, it's a lot of money, and that's not on the table. It is tens and hundreds of billions, but that could resolve a major crisis that we've got in our country. In terms of the licensing scheme, I think we're comfortable. We believe that the places we've gone into and then gone back to, we believe that they've got better. I always want to see something for the whole community to show that it's, to say this has now resulted in a ratchet up as opposed to just the 1,200 landlords of those properties. But we are very confident that as we move into now going to visit other landlords where we've now got more experience with, we can assist and be supportive. As I say, 1,200 landlords, got 28,000 landlords, so there's tens of thousands of them want to do the right thing.
Yes.
We think the answer is yes, but as I say, we're working on getting... we know that the amount of antisocial behaviour has gone down. We know that. Yeah. There are good things that have happened. But...
Okay, all right. Simon, you...
Thank you. It's demonstrably true that the number of schedules and notices served are much higher in licensed areas rather than non-licensed areas.
And compliance with those schedules has improved?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got some stats for that, but as a broad brush...
Okay. I think it would be terribly helpful, rather than taking the time now,
sure,
is if you could pass those stats to us, because in terms of our report, I think that'd be very helpful, rather than going to the nitty-gritty at this point.
I think those were covered off in Blackpool Council's submission to the report. The only thing I'd add is that we've also, in addition to the statistics, which we'll send again just in case you haven't had them, but we've got hundreds of case studies, which we'd be more than happy to share whatever would be useful with you, to demonstrate how, almost as an aside to the living conditions, officers, be they of the council or the Department of Work and Pensions, police or fire or others, have been able to have a positive impact on people's lives, which wouldn't have happened had we not have had the legal power to get behind the front door.
Right.
And I speak as a former social worker. The ability to get behind the front door is crucial if you're able to start to assist people with their difficulties.
Okay. Tony, can I just ask from an LGA perspective, irrespective of the evidence here about whether it improves or not, because obviously you've got experience as leader of Croydon, but the other issue is it a requirement to have a licensing scheme to actually prosecute rogue landlords? Given that local authorities can do that anyway, why do they need a licensing scheme?
Well, I think it enhances the possibility of a positive outcome in terms of prosecution, and if you're in breach of the licensing scheme, clearly there are some issues you wouldn't need. If there's fire regulations, other health and safety regulations, sure. But what a licensing scheme does, it gives a very, very clear focus to a set of conditions that should be met. In terms of your question to colleagues here about noticeable improvements, well, I think we're in transition from anecdotal evidence to real evidence. I touched on the gas safety certificates earlier that we suddenly saw flooding through, all renewed. I think we've issued 160 improvement notices in Croydon in the last year, but actually, interestingly, we've refused, it's not a huge number, but we've refused 10 licences. Now, if you could imagine a scheme that was rolled out nationally, it's the conditions that might have been in those properties that, unless they do something significant about, won't be coming onto the rented market as well. So there's a prevention agenda, I think, starting to emerge as well, about not allowing the worst quality stuff to come onto the market in the first place, where local government has the ability to act. And you wouldn't be able to do most of that without a licensing scheme. Yes, you can still make prosecutions, but I don't think you have the clarity and the force you have with a licensing scheme behind you.
So, Robin,
there's two reasons why you have to have it.
Yeah.
One, you can identify them.
No, I think you've made that clear.
That's really important, because
I understand that.
And secondly, is then you can then enforce different standards. You can ask for more things, and one of the things I should have mentioned was that before licensing, in half the cases we served notices on, they came back. Nothing happened. It didn't work. Now we think it's 1 in 10 that we have to go back and repeat it. It does make it visible, and you can then enforce a better standard. So without it, we couldn't do it.
You're almost doubling the amount of money you're charging landlords to register, from going up from 400 to 750. How concerned are you that landlords, who are not the criminals, but landlords with, as you say, the 1 or 2 properties, will just say, okay, fine, I've got to pay it, fair enough, I will just put this on the rent. And so hard-pressed tenants already are going to see an increase in their rent as a result of the registration process.
So we're putting it to £400 if you pay early. It'll be £400 for 5 years. It's not £400 a year, so it's £80 a year. It's tax deductible, which we always like to point out to landlords, so that you'll all be paying tax, so that must be a good thing. Our view is that we're going to use it, as I say, to up the offer. We don't make any money from it. We want to up the offer to landlords, and then go around some of the more amateur landlords and make sure they're doing the right things in terms of safety, fire, and all the rest of it. And we'll see where on that. So the other thing is, we were in very early. We were the first borough-wide, so as a result, we didn't quite know where to set the levels of charges. These charges are less than other people have set. I don't want to charge. It's £80 a year if you pay early. The tax system will be more than that. So I don't think that's unreasonable, but certainly we increased it. But that's because when we set it, we realised that it cost us more than we actually got back. Yeah.
The others, a 5-year licence will cost £750 after.
No, but if you pay before the middle of March, you'll get £400. It's £400 because we think we want to encourage people. We want the good landlords who register early, and remember we know who many of them are now, to get in early. Fine.
Yeah. Okay. Right, fine. The other issue, which I just want to cover very briefly, is this threshold to do this licensing scheme. The current threshold is 20%. Is that the right level? Should it be? No. What's your view on?
No, it should be local discretion to be 100%.
Yeah.
Right. The idea that it's 20%. I mean, that you can have an area of a town, a city, a borough, whatever, where there's one set of regulations and conditions, and then literally over the street there could be something else different in play, and I think it really does. Bring the whole thing potentially into disrepute, and the idea that judgment of 20% is made at a national level. I mean, I think the Mayor of London's argued for a London-wide approach, and boroughs would work within London. But I mean, as a principle, the LGA would be very clear indeed that it should be, as I've said earlier, it should be something devolved to local councils to make that decision and have to justify it or not to their local populations. You cannot run something like this from the centre. It simply doesn't make sense on any level.
We would say exactly the same. We'd recommend that part of the process is removed entirely. Okay. It takes a very long time. It's supposed to take 8 weeks. In our case, most recent case, it took 20 weeks, and we have anecdotal evidence from colleagues around the country of it taking a similar length of time, notwithstanding referendum, general elections and other things intervening. In the normal run of things, it can take anything up to 4 or 5 months. But also, the Minister's decision is very heavily dependent upon the advice of their civil servants. Now, following a visit from the Permanent Secretary of the DCLG to Blackpool, who very specifically asked to look at the standards in our private rented sector, we find that there's a very informed attitude in DCLG, as it was then, about what the housing problems in Blackpool are, but to expect civil servants advising ministers to understand what the different challenges in Newham, Croydon, Blackpool or anywhere else you care to mention are, seems ludicrous. Yes. Further to that, it appears to me to be completely contrary to the spirit of localism. I can think of no sound reason why that would be a power that central government would want to hoard in Whitehall.
Can I ask one final thing, because I think time is moving on and we do need to move on. Tony, is there an LGA view on what the standards should be for HMOs and the legislation? Is there a settled position from the LGA perspective?
I don't think there's a settled position, but you've heard colleagues touch on earlier, the current position is unacceptable in terms of what people are able to say is a bedroom. People can put in what ticks a box in terms of kitchen facilities with a one ring, probably unsafe gas appliance or whatever. So there isn't a settled position, but there is a clear, I think, settled view that there needs to be more powers and decisions, I've already said, devolve locally. And nationally, we need to see a change in the standards. Some of the minimum standards are too minimum.
Clearly, the issue of enforcement and prosecution and so on flows from what the standards are.
It does. Right. It does, and there's a clear view that the standards need to be improved. Yeah. How you then interpret, enforce, work with, as I've already argued, then perhaps is where it becomes part of the local decision-making process. But there are some standards that have to be set nationally.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew.
Slight change of topic. Could you tell us about some of the alternative approaches that you've taken as local authorities, or local authorities you know about more widely, that have taken to promote high-quality private rented accommodation?
Well, Blackpool Council has set up a private housing company called My Blackpool Homes. We were successful in attracting, it was £28 million worth of borrowing direct from the Treasury through the Regional Growth Fund. And we are using that money and that company to buy up poor quality private rented sector housing. If I can give the committee an illustrative example, we found a property for sale that was converted into 12 bedsits. It was on the market for £150,000. We bought it for £150,000. We spent £300,000 on it, so our total investment was £450,000. We turned it from 12 bedsits into 3 very pleasant, very high quality 3-bedroom flats. We are able to rent that out to tenants and to make a return of between 6 and 7% a year. The private sector landlord who had been operating it prior to us was operating it as 12 bedsits and was making a yield of around 34% a year. So it is perfectly possible for councils, given the resources, and it's a slightly different, I'm not quite sure how much it would cost Robin to buy a 12-bedroom block of flats in Newham. I suspect it'd be slightly more than £150,000. But the ability in an area like ours is there to fundamentally change the face of the housing market. But irrespective of property values, a particular issue for us is the fact that values are inflated by the rental income. So, for instance, I live in a 4-bedroom detached house on the outskirts of town that is worth about £160,000. In the very centre of the town, 4-bedroom terraced houses are changing hands for more than that. Not because anybody wants to live there or raise a family there in a 4-bedroom terraced house, but because of the capacity of investors to break those units down into 6 or 7 flats. The housing benefit yield therefore keeps that false market going, if you will.
I'm going to go to Blackpool.
Do
you good deal?
So we've done a number of things. One of the things we've done is we've introduced a lettings agents rating scheme, giving agents a rating of 1 to 5. One of the interesting things when we were doing the private sector licensing scheme originally, one of the things that we got from landlords was, please do something about lettings agents, because they are getting off with quite a lot, and I actually one of the problems I think landlords face, so we're very keen on that. If we talk about what we did, we set up some time ago a housing association called Local Space, which has purchased properties locally over the last 10 years and now has 1,800 properties which are at LHA rents, and which homeless families are in. And they're not really, they're class temporary accommodation, but they're not, people stay there. They're buying another 800 to 1,200, we guarantee the rents, and if they're guaranteed the rents, they're then able to borrow the money to buy the properties. So this is having a big impact. We think it's the biggest impact on homelessness of any authority. We've set up a housing company, in fact we've set up 2 housing companies. One, Red Door, has built a block of flats and changed, and they've now got 800 which have gone through planning. We're using our land to build, and the plan is that they will build both 35% affordable, there's a got standard rent in London, but for the private rent, they will rent them out, and we will take the profits and reinvest that in housing. And the plan is to build 15,000 homes in Newham and reinvest the market rents back into either affordability or more building. And in our budget we have 2 billion that we want to put into that. We've set up then an affordable company which will take the affordable homes. We purchased 211 at the site of the Bowling Ground recently for £50 million. Hardly the price of a striker, but hey, it's the old Upton Park, right? It's West Ham's old ground. They are going to reduce rents based on income, so we'll do market rents at 40, 60, whatever your income is, we will tailor then the rent to that income, because we think that's a better way of providing support and assistance to people. By and large, we're aiming for 30% of your income goes on rent. I think at the moment 60% of the average rate is what the rent is in Newham. So it's so the aim is to quite substantially. We've got a buying program. Red Door's also bought a large block flat and buying another block. So we have quite a substantial purchasing program as well. And the aim is again, and it was announced by the Labour Party yesterday, to buy property and then try and use that to deal with the homelessness issue at the same time, the affordability, to enable us to get people there. But we also believe that you just need to build a lot, and if you build a lot, typically in London 15 to 20,000 built with the private sector every year, you need to build 40 to 50, and it's that gap that's not been filled for many years. So our view is we have to have companies like this to go in and build. So we think we're doing quite a lot, and the plan is that the housing company, Red Door, will just continue to recycle profits ad infinitum, just keep putting it back into more building and more building and more building until we get the sort of levels of building that we need to do in London. That's if we can get the land, but we don't mind buying land elsewhere.
Two really good examples. I mean, there is. It's probably the moment to ensure we do say in terms of the areas where supply is a huge challenge, that lifting the HRA borrowing cap would empower local authorities in terms of supply. That's seen so much of the pressure come on the private rented sector. There are large schemes like that. We actually launched through an organisation of councils working together, the Co-op Innovation Network, in this building last week. A document I would commend to the committee around community housing schemes, where local government is working with different communities from memory, Hull, Leeds, Oldham, East Cambridgeshire, different models, but some of them much smaller schemes, bringing back into use 5, 10, 20 properties. Some of them were bigger projects as well. So some of this is around some very big schemes, but some of it, there is some very innovative work happening out there with local government on a scale perhaps that doesn't always attract the headline attention, working with different community groups up and down the country with some quite innovative schemes, which I'm very happy to ensure the committee gets a copy of that publication.
Now, can we just move on to the draft tenant fees bill now? Probably fairly briefly, because I'm conscious of the time going on. Liz.
Yeah, okay. So the first question from me is, do you think the draft bill will give local trading standards an appropriate level of enforcement powers, or is there a risk that the draft bill isn't compliant with the Human Rights Act?
I think the draft bill has the potential to work. I've heard the point raised somewhere around the Human Rights Act. I'm struggling to see that. I mean, I'm much more interested in the human rights of the tenants in this situation. frankly. So from what I've seen of the bill from the colleagues who've looked at the bill at the LGA, we are confident around the framework. I think there is, without going through the covering the ground we've covered earlier, a challenge around the when we get to the enforcement piece. If it's not happening, there's a clear role for training standards, but then we'll be back into the resources of what we have got or haven't got in local government. So I think it's another one of those categories where this is absolutely the right thing to be doing, but we need to make sure collectively that it's properly resourced so it can actually be delivered and action can be taken where people are in breach of it.
Yeah, and is there a potential, is it right for trading standards to decide when to impose a penalty, if it then keeps the penalty?
I think yes, I think, and I think the penalty, as long as the penalty is being reinvested in the process of enforcement, if I can put it like that, if that's what the situation is, yes.
If I may, the penalties in the draft bill suggested at £5,000. It goes back to a point that Robin made earlier on. That's a very small disincentive for lettings agencies and landlords to do things properly, if that's the most that they can be fined. Going back to your initial question, whether or not we've got the right level of enforcement powers to deal with this is almost an academic question, as long as we don't have the resources with which to enforce it. And we would say that the bill, if the bill's going to be effective, it needs to be simplified to just very clearly state a ban on all upfront fees, which would enable us to target enforcement action. Because as it's worded at the moment, it's very difficult, I would say, for the consumer to understand exactly what is and isn't outlawed. I spoke to a friend earlier on, knowing that she had recently moved house in Blackpool from one private rented sector property to another, and the total fee to move in, which included an application fee, a tenancy fee, a credit check fee and a referencing fee, was £300. She was then charged a further £39 checkout fee when she left the property, and a further £15 fee for that lettings agency to provide a reference to the new lettings agency. So that came to £354, which was the equivalent of 2.5 weeks' rent. There needs to be a very explicit statement about what is banned and what isn't. That would allow us to target meagre enforcement resources where they need to be targeted, but the penalties would need to be higher than they are in the draft bill for landlords to really be concerned. Bear in mind that in a small town like Blackpool with only 142,000 residents, we've got over 100 different letting agencies operating, many of which are based in places like London and Brighton, so the costs of enforcement and pursuing recalcitrant landlords and agents will be considerable.
So if you're going to do it, you have to enforce. I come back to the minimum wage. 20% of people in my borough do not get the minimum wage, the statutory minimum wage, and nobody enforces. Because to enforce against bad employers, well, we're not allowed to. We would if we could. We'd do it for nothing because we just think it's something we want to do. So you need to be able to enforce. Enforcement involves a cash problem. Now, for me, I struggle to understand this. We first of all think we should be licensing lettings agents anyway. We think that should be a power given to local authorities to license them. Then if there are bad ones, you have to ramp up your enforcement. So make them pay for it. Why is everybody else having to pay for it when they, who are breaking the law or doing the wrong things, aren't paying for it? Make the fines sufficient to cover the costs. Then when people start to conform, we'll reduce the enforcement because it won't cost so much, and then it won't cost so much. I struggle to understand this. I quoted the £4,000 for a £500,000 business earlier. I struggle to understand why people are reluctant to say, if you break the law and are making a profit from it, we will hit you with it. So I genuinely struggle to that. We're talking about people conducting businesses, deliberately breaking the law, and in that case they should pay massive fines, the sort that would help us then enforce. Nobody breaks the law, we don't have to enforce. Happy days. So I struggle with this. I do think that funding a freestance is challenging. It is a difficult time, and we do think more trading standards checks than most, because we think it's really important. We think enforcing and trying to change things for people is very important. But I genuinely do not understand the reluctance to say that those who choose to criminally ignore what we decide to do, I do not understand why they do not pay for the cost of the enforcement. Not the other ones, because they're doing the right thing. So yes, I'd massively up the fines, and I would give local authorities much more scope to it. As I said, we've introduced a rating system. Interestingly, when we did it, we had a whole number that were 0 rated, and we wrote to them, guess what? They all got up to 1 or 2 because they all didn't want to be had. So that was quite a useful thing to do. So I think if we can give us a power to license and give us the right to be able to retain the costs. It's like everything. It's like if you want people to not to use their mobile phones, give us the right to keep the fine. You don't drive in a bus lane because we fine you, but you use your mobile phone because we don't fine you, and we don't keep. It's about linking those things together, linking enforcement with the crime, with then the people who are doing the enforcement, who have the enforcement costs. But we could still do with more money because we're local government. We always ask for more money.
So you were talking there about licensing letting agents.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you think would be more effective in regulating?
Yes, I think we could drive some of that business, which would be fantastic. And then the good ones would provide a better service, nice and clear what we're doing. It's what Simon was saying, be clear about what you're doing, have clarity in it, and then people know where they are. But yes, there are a whole bunch of cowboys, just like there are a bunch of cowboy landlords that need to be sorted out. The rest of them, that then leaves the others who are trying to do their business properly, that leaves them to do their business, and it's good for the good ones.
Tenants would say and tell us frequently that the artificial and rather unhelpful split between letting agent and landlord is where an awful lot of requests for repairs or upgrades go wrong, because the letting agent will tell the tenant that they're only handling the letting of the property. It's down to the landlord to deal with the repairs. That can create a 2 or 3 week time lag where the tenant is talking to the letting agent, who is talking, no doubt at a reasonably leisurely pace, to the landlord about what they do or don't want to do about the situation. Most landlords, reputable or otherwise, will work through a lettings agency. If we can deal with the agency as a whole rather than chasing individual landlords round, it's a much more efficient process from a local authority point of view.
It's mainly anecdotal, but bad, which I think is the point you're making, that bad letting agents often let down perfectly decent landlords, because they can be the reputational damage to both the landlord and the frustration for the tenant in trying to get something resolved. And they seem to have up till now, been the one group no one's paid enough attention to. But that hopefully is changing.
An anecdote on that. I'm told that now behaviour's changing, that more landlords are saying to let's agents, I just want to find a tenant because I want to avoid tax, because tax is now becoming much more difficult for landlords, and I struggle to see how it works for landlords who are borrowing money to buy property. So in order to stay off the radar, they're using it, they're changing their behaviour. And that's one of the things I would say. These things change very, very quickly, and they change very, very locally. And if that's right, then you suddenly see a transformation in lettings agents and landlords, because people are trying to stay off the radar of tax, of HMRC. So that's why local can respond quicker.
Okay. One more question. If trading standards sue to recover a financial penalty, Schedule 3, Paragraph 7.3, which I'm sure you all have at your fingertips, would prevent defendants from proving they had paid. Do local authorities need this conclusive evidence provision, and is it fair to defendants? Sounds a bit technical.
It's a good question.
It's a very good question, and I think we'll give you a detailed written response.
Okay. Yeah. You can, and I think we've covered the financial penalties aspect, the amount.
Yeah, so I want to drill down a little bit more on the enforcement, and obviously you've spoke a little bit about that, but obviously if there's anything else that anyone can contribute. So will the retention of money levied through civil penalties sufficiently equip local trading standards? And you have, I know, with regards to resource. partly answered that, but as well then to sort of dig deeper into are there any other feasible bodies other than local authorities or any alternative mechanisms that...
They may well be, but I think we would be clear that local authority is the best place to do it. And I think it's quite legitimate then to make the case that if you're going to have a regulation system, that it needs to be resourced properly financially to make it work. So I think we've all from different perspectives made it clear that in terms of investing any penalties, which we've again made clear should be more than they are, back into the system, that will help, but it shouldn't by definition be a system entirely based on that. We need to start to see some different priorities in terms of funding, and we do need to see extra resources in this area, because this is an area where you can you can have a far greater impact on people's life chances, the health of them, their families, their children, as well as the immediate appalling conditions sometimes people are in. So we think local authority is the best place to do it, but it has to come hand in hand with the devolution of the licensing schemes, and without going through the whole piece again, to local governments, and let local communities within a national framework of enhanced standards take a lead in their communities with what then will be the different local challenges.
Is that LGA response as well? Is that something that they...
The LGA is very, very keen to see local government significantly empowered in this area, because we do believe that the evidence, as hopefully you've heard to a degree here today, of where that is put in place, it does improve people's life chances and the standards of the accommodation they live in.
I deal with most aspects of licensing, regulatory and public protection work for the LGA, and what we would say about any of those areas is that there ought to be, the fees ought to represent a full cost recovery model, so whatever it costs local government to enforce and police those regulations ought to equal what we are able to charge. But also there's a very important point around the, and Robin touched on it earlier, the polluter pays principle. If an organisation or an individual is breaking the law or is creating a set of circumstances whereby the law is broken, it is absolutely right that they should bear the burden of that. The problem with the idea of a lead enforcement agency is that if taking the fact that there are 100 different lettings agencies operating in Blackpool alone, we would need to have a very clear point of contact, and they would need to be super responsive to be able to match the sort of response that our local trading standards and housing enforcement teams will be able to match. So it doesn't strike me as an obvious way of, I'm not quite sure how it could speed the system up. What it could do, I guess, is to have a bigger resource behind it, but wouldn't it be much simpler just to hand that resource over to the local authority or allow them to fully recover their costs? When we see complex regulatory cases ending up in courts, which can take years and years, not least in terms of trading standards cases, the costs that accrue to local authorities can be in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And at the moment, that is proving to be a bit of a pull factor on local authorities' ability to enforce as rigidly as we would like.
I think we get into very difficult places here. Local authorities have got responsibility for doing many, many things. And the truth is, as we've found, we're doing some interesting stuff on some public sector reform stuff, unless you shine a light on something, it can sit in a backwater and nothing will happen. So trading standards, I don't know when was the last time you were knocking on a door and somebody said, I want your trading standards to do this or that. The truth is, they don't very much. So we'll say, we want trading standards to go in and do things with kids. We want them to, cigarettes, knives, alcohol, every shop should be visited to do that. And that resonates a bit with people, but to try and get them to do other things and do, the replica shut down the market, do I care if Man United are being ripped off or Man City are being ripped off? Do I care? Not really. I should, but it's their problem. Somebody has to fund it. I don't see why my residents should be funding it. So, yes, it's absolutely a question. And what you have to do is decide what it is you're going to focus on. I think one of my criticisms of government would be that there is no way of measuring and comparing local authorities. So I want to know if we are the most active in this area. I want to be the most active. I don't know because I can't get the bloody figures to tell me. Now for me that's important because for me this is a moral question, so I want to do it. Then you should get to a place that says, look, whatever you do, if you're breaking the law, particularly in business area, this sort of area, not about criminal cases, but something slightly different here, people having a business model to operate, you must pay. And you must pay the full costs of what it costs the local authority. And even if you're only the only person doing it, you should pay all of the costs because it's you that's forcing us to continue to do these things. And if nobody's breaking the law, then we can ramp down a bit. And I think that's important. There is no doubt that the pressure in these budgets across local authorities, we choose to put a lot into enforcement. We think it's the right thing to do. Not everybody thinks that. It's difficult. So they will, and because there's no comparison or anything, you can think, are we doing right? It makes it very difficult. And we actually tried, I had my research people do, I said, find out what I want to compare us with local authorities. It's really difficult to do it, and that doesn't help us then work out, are we doing a good job or doing a bad job? I don't think my electors will necessarily care on some of these. There's something, so licensing and housing, they do care about, because they are sick to death of the bad behaviour and the antisocial behaviour that you get in private rent properties from the badly run ones. So they do care about that, but others, it's where we want to do a good job. So I think it's a really complex issue, but in terms of money, yeah, I see no reason why fines shouldn't reflect the cost of the local authorities, because you are the one that's causing the problem. I still to this day do not understand why we don't. I'll come back again and say, you cannot drive your car in the wrong places at the wrong times because we get the money, so we enforce. Now, people say to me, you get too much, I say, don't break the law. It's exactly the same for all these things. So why does it work on bus lanes, but doesn't work on kids buying tobacco? Explain that, or on landlords with 25 people in a property.
Can I just we have no, that's fine, Clive, because we're timed. Sorry.
Okay, so I think we have to end it there. Thank you very much for coming to give evidence today. Thank you very much.